Welcome to another edition of Consensus Unreality.
You've been doing the intros a lot lately. I think
Wow.
you should let me do it.
You want to give it a shot?
Welcome to another episode of Consensus Unreality.
Wow, yeah, that's the thing, right? You gotta pause for a second.
This is not
Consensus Unreality.
the real world.
Yeah, this episode, this is as we mentioned on the last episode, we're hitting the ground running in 2024, trying to release a lot more episodes, half of which will be on our Patreon and half of which will have some public content. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, check that out for just $5 a month at patreon.com/consensusunreality. We have our full episode archive there. We only have a little bit of the archive. Small portion is on the public podcasting platforms. So it's all hosted on Patreon. You have the unique RSS feed that you can listen to it on whichever preferred website. You have our backlog of written content. Tons of weird kind of experimental conjuration things that we've worked on in the past, and we're going to be talking about some re-engagement of that kind of work in tonight's episode. Maybe for better or for worse, right, Ben?
I think, I guess, we'll see. I think somehow we've entered into another synchro weirdness spiral. Maybe it's not a spiral, maybe it's a cube, but yeah, we'll see where it goes. So maybe not weekly episodes, but maybe weekly episodes. This is weekly so far. So
And
there'll be a little bit more scattershot, but I think that'll be an interesting approach to the podcast that we haven't really done so far yet. Just kind of an almost jazz-like back and forth.
Well, I feel like we've gotten pretty jazzy in the past for sure, but it's I'm excited about kind of going through the thought process a little bit in terms of how we build our lengthier, researchy episodes. Getting into some of that stuff this week with what I was looking at in the past few days.
Yeah, me too.
Some of the thoughts for sure. But yeah, patreon.com/consensusunreality. It's the best way to support us if you like what we do for the price of a latte, Ben. $5 a month.
These days, half a latte.
Right? And we're looking to add some really special new features this year to our second tier of Patreon, which will be really cool, getting us hopefully back into the physical media realm. But more to be talked about on that in the future. So what have you been checking out this week?
I've been reading this book, The Resonance of Unseen Things by Susan Lepselter, which is incredible so far. It's a book I've had on the shelf. I think I bought it not so far after it came out, and it's just one of those books. It's I want this, for reference, because it's subtitled Poetics, Power, Captivity, and UFOs in the American Uncanny. So it's an academic book. I guess you'd call it a theory book. And I have not finished this book yet, as is often the case when we end up talking about stuff. Although I feel like that's to the benefit of it sometimes, to talk about an ongoing process of interacting with a book it won't be as book reporty as if I were to be talking about a book I just completed and looking at the entire scope of it. I think it's kind of cool to be in the middle of it, which I am now. Anyway, it's a really fascinating book. It doesn't seem like it really landed with much of a splash the way some of the other academic books on these subjects have, some of Jeffrey Kripal's books, or at least the first book by Pasulka. This in some ways feels like Pasulka's American Cosmic from a very, very different angle, whereas hers is I'm not sure what the word I would use would be, a bit more reverent of the reality of these things and how that is sort of forming this new religion, new sort of UFO spirituality religion, especially among the sort of technological centers in America. But this one is much more ethnographic, but in this weird sort of poetics way. It's about the actually, I'll just read the first paragraph of it, which I think is a pretty fascinating like thesis. This is not a book about UFOs. It's not a history of UFO belief, nor a sociology of believers. Rather, this is a book about a vernacular American poetics, something you can hear building up in the stories I will tell. The content of these stories varies, but their themes keep circling back to a sense that life in America is shaped by some ineffable, enormous power, a power that can be seen only in the patterns of its effects, which is oddly something we've kind of been talking about on this show, these seeing these enormous synchronistic objects that you can only really see through their effects, basically. And so I've started reading this since we talked about some of the C.G. Jung stuff last week. And yeah, it's really actually kind of blowing me away. This isn't like a extreme, it's not extremely like reverent of people's beliefs. It's certainly looking at them as um, subjects in a quasi ethnographical kind of ethnographic study, but at the same time, she was sort of living with these people in this town she calls Hillview. Um, and she's switching out a lot of names with things to protect identity in this book, but she was spending a lot of time with like UFO believers and how they sort of morphed into the sort of New World Order kind of believers. And she's kind of tracing this thread of American speech, which she kind of calls a poetics, a way of talking about this blank somethingness that is behind the scenes, sort of dictating or controlling American life. So it changes from UFO abductees talking about them, the aliens kind of coming and doing what they'd like with you, to, you know, like the Rockefellers or what have you. The way this them continues to morph and how it's spoken about. And maybe I'll get a bit more into some of the specifics of the book later, perhaps in the Patreon segment of the episode. But that's kind of what I've been interacting with lately on the whole, as well as continuing reading Lewis Hyde's Trickster Makes This World, which has had its own series of weird little revelations. What about you?
Yeah. And that's funny too. It sounds almost like Downardian, right? Like the
Yeah.
that famous line in King Kill 33 where it's like behind Coca-Cola and hot dogs there lurks like what's the famous phrase in there?
Yeah.
At least I think it's famous where he's
mean.
like the psychosexual melodrama that
Yeah,
plays
yeah.
itself out. It almost sounds like it's kind of relates to that of there's something endemic,
Paranoid awareness. Yeah.
yeah, it's sociologically endemic of like Americana. Lot to unpack there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I guess we can circle back to that, as they say in American offices.
Do a couple loops. There's probably some of that in, that's, I'm sure that in one way or another, what I've been reading this week could relate back into that. I was listening to a different podcast last week, and they happened to mention John Keel's first book, which is called Jadoo, which is supposed to be a Middle Eastern magical word that can, when said, can open tombs and close caskets. It's kind of like a phrase that can open magical doors, I guess.
Like open sesame.
Sure. And this book came out in 1957. He was writing it in 55. The reason why it appealed to me so much is I kind of never really heard anybody talk about this portion of Keel's work, and the way that it was referred is that talking about the possible irreality or unreality of
Yeah.
these claims, because the publisher basically billed it as a real life Indiana Jones. I think that was the selling hook for Jadoo. So I wanted to check it out, and I was thinking a bit about yellow journalism and the carryover from last week's episode, after having read Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel, which is his second book in 1975, but really is kind of the first proper book of what his work would be known for, I guess. But Jadoo, I was surprised. Obviously, there's an expected amount of exotica making up the story, and it's kind of it's more aware and less harsh in that tone than you might expect from something written when it was.
Yeah.
But it's pretty interesting. I'm not sure the validity of a lot of the stories, and it kind of gets into the realm of, it almost seems like there was a little bit of test kitting certain truth fiction kind of writing that would be an aspect, certainly, of things like the Mothman prophecies, which we kind of were discussing a little bit. This Skeptico article that came out after Gray Barker passed away.
The Skeptic Review or something, or Skeptical Inquirer.
Yeah, right.
Skeptico is the podcast.
Right.
Shout out Skeptico.
Right.
Yeah, that was by what's his name?
Sherwood, who
Sherwood, yeah.
He forgetting his first name, but he investigated the first Michigan flap of UFOs that later the same sightings came to be tied with the Midwestern Ohio, Eastern Midwestern. Wow. That's I don't know. Is that a region that actually exists, but
Middle East?
Yeah, right.
His name is John C. Sherwood.
Yeah. But I don't know, in this article, he's basically saying that Keel and Gray Barker obviously exchanged a lot of letters. They were friends, and Keel was kind of known amongst his friends for writing these like fantastic, goofy letters. But I guess within there's a lot of aspects of the accounts that would make up the Mothman prophecies, and Sherwood points out a lot of discrepancies between those original accounts and how they're told in the book. And I'm not really sure if it's not like, oh, well, that disproves the whole thing, or even if you need to, I mean, we're obviously not here to do that, but I think it's interesting to start to parse out the possible reality of some of these things, or what it might mean. And that's kind of like what we were talking to Andy Sharp with about Kenneth Grant and the possible reality of what the rituals at the New Isis Lodge could have potentially looked like theatrically or something. It feels a similar way with this stuff in Keel's work. But yeah, I could talk a little bit about some of the things in Jadoo. Have you ever checked this one out?
No, I never read it, but I think it brings up that interesting point of like, does it matter if the things in Keel or Barker's books are true? Whenever I see someone kind of going after the validity of these things, as you often do, it's like, it's a big part of the UFO culture is people going after older accounts and trying to sort of contextualize them within a something else. They're trying to sort of say that, oh no, this is not what was happening. It was actually this. And so I always kind of am like, well, they're building a folklore here, and to think of it as, it just seems like people approach it the wrong way.
I think the distinction is really interesting with Keel, especially. I saw some threads recently that were talking about how Jacques Vallée reviewed some of Keel's work and spoke about the importance of things like Operation Trojan Horse and the Mothman Prophecies, and J. Allen Hynek as well. And I think it's kind of the way that the scene, the ufology scene, looks at Keel as somebody who was trying to bring to light some truth, or some, truths about the phenomena. And in that way, he kind of becomes this authority or voice on a certain lens that might describe the phenomena, whereas somebody like Gray Barker was admittedly a trickster, and Jim Moseley as well.
Right.
So their myth making is kind of exists more in that world of goofs and pulp, and
I feel like Keel has to be in there somewhere too, though.
well, he is.
I mean,
That's the thing. Yeah,
so it's funny
yeah.
he has this reputation because if he's telling the truth, and I think that he is, I think he's doing that trick of telling the truth about the phenomena, about these various, Mothman, UFOs, Men in Black, about these various things that constitute this world. He's telling the truth about them by sometimes making stuff up and telling a true lie, as they say. That seems like that's how I've thought of Keel, and whether or not any particular case in his books are literal telling of fact is, I guess it's interesting to know whether or not one of those things really happened, but it feels like he's doing something a bit more strange, maybe, than being like a reporter.
Yeah, I think what I gather from what you're saying too is that it might be important in trying to reveal something occult, in that you do it through a sense of narrative and myth making, as opposed to releasing some dry what's the word, like survey of ufology, where it's kind of just like report after report. Maybe using narrative in an interesting way, more effectively reveals something occult about the phenomena.
Yeah, there's something in this Lepselter book. The exact quote, it's toward the end of one of these early sections. He says, the stories here are the real objects. Mm-hmm. So the story, like, she's of course very interested in like the oral existence of these UFO encounter stories and these weird event synchronicity stories. But it is the actual telling of these stories and the way that they transmit and then transmute between people. That is what she thinks the object actually is in this, which feels in some ways similar, and maybe it's sort of coloring my thought on the Keel thing at the moment, as happens when you're reading a kind of a compelling book. But this idea of resonance, which is in the title as well, is really important. She's using it in the sense of trying to describe apophenia, which is kind of funny that we were talking about that thing with Carmelo a couple episodes ago, apophenic realism, but she calls it resonant apophenia. And so it's the similarities and the connections between things in this sort of conspiratorial or ufological way of thinking, this I guess she's kind of describing synchromysticism. The it's a resonance. It's not it's not lines on a board that you're connecting
Hmm.
exactly. It's you like ring one thing and you see what else kind of rings in that same tone is sort of how she's describing this style of thought, this kind of very, maybe it's a little like American centric to call it an American thing, but I see what she means about that too, about how this culture has sort of uh, grown in the fertile soil of American whateverness, whatever it is that makes America or made America. I don't know if it's still this way, made it this sort of paranoid land,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
But
I still think there's something there with the way that we've constructed American mythology to have that sort of like stranger mentality, like you can remake yourself in America. It's obviously a country made up of immigrants. And the way that like, the myths from all over the world and that the settlers brought from Europe and stuff kind of got obscured and ground down and reemerge.
yeah,
I think kind of fits into all of that. And also our cult, like our, we've filled maybe a mythological void with um, our pop culture, and I think that we kind of like there is that sense of hyperactive connectivity that you see with like pop culture and symbology and the urge to want to like see meaning in things that are often mundane.
yeah. Maybe moving back into Keel a little bit. I listened to a bit of I guess it was Coast to Coast AM interview that Keel did back in the day, and I feel for some reason like I mentioned this on the podcast before, but thinking of like the Mothman thing, um, pre like whatever has happened since. Like I don't know exactly when it happened when Mothman became a sort of a like a Pokemon for people.
The
But
movie,
like
probably, right?
I think it must have been after that because the movie was kind of like a poorly received horror movie,
Yeah, but I
and
think it
like
got the story out there in a different way,
it did,
obviously.
yeah. And
The
it
legend.
at least it got it, yeah. It gave it a digestible form, even if that wasn't. It didn't happen like immediately. I guess it probably did inject it into the cultural brain a little bit, but. Yeah, listening to Keel talk about the whole experience of the Mothman saga and comparing it to like the sort of cryptid mania that we have, like maybe it's dying down a bit now, but for a few years it was sort of I guess in the way like X-Files and Aliens were sort of a signifier of counterculture. Um, if it's even possible to have a counterculture today, I don't know, but it feels like they're like a signifier of this desire for a counterculture, maybe like being interested in like the Mothman as a, I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that is kind of just like there's always this urge. You cannot transcend myths, and the urge to want to like fill in myths, or I guess that maybe they just emerge. I mean, um, I don't know. The I guess I'll circle back to and to Keel and what kind of got me reading Jadoo was in Operation Trojan Horse. He talks a lot about the airship wave of
Yeah.
the late 1800s, and for me, like there's a whole crazy connection there. I think I first heard about this when some show was talking about Empire of the Wheel, which is by Walter Bosley. Um,
Hmm.
we read Bosley's Disney book, like his book on
Sure did.
Disneyland,
Yeah.
for an episode. Um,
Is that still up?
was
That
hoping
I don't think it is.
was hoping you weren't going to ask.
Sign up
Wow.
for the Patreon.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I don't know. To me, like, there's this whole crazy connection in the Empire of the Wheel story, and if you look up this guy Charles Delshow, this is all a real thing. This guy, his house was excavated, I think, in the 70s, and they found this book with these like really beautiful folk art collages and diagrams of airships,
Hmm.
um, and this story of the Sonora Airship Club. I'm sorry, the Sonora Aero Club, which is, probably a creation of Charles Delshow, not unlike the books that were found from Henry Darger.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that he was, similar personality wise, because Darger's kind of an interesting reclusive folk artist, but
Yeah.
a similar thing that was found. But then there's this whole backstory that gets checkered in with, a Mr. X kind of intelligence figure, and a breakaway, the idea of a breakaway civilization having developed some kind of airship technology, and it's this flowery thing. But if you read about the airship wave, it really is something that's completely seems indebted to newspaper articles, and it was at the time at the height of like yellow journalism, and the
Yeah.
war between Pulitzer and Hearst. And there's if you read about yellow journalism, there's crazy stuff about it. Its involvement in the Spanish-American War, and the birth of I don't know, the kind of propaganda that was like so sensational it could cause like upheaval and stuff like that.
Right.
And then I think Pulitzer is the one who really kind of like, he was the one who was supposed to be taking the higher road, and then he was like, he got his feet wet in yellow journalism because he was kind of defending himself, and then he pulled back afterwards. And I don't know, it's this whole strange history. But to me, I don't know, the airship thing seems like it's something that could just be from, yellow journalism of that era, and that it kind of spawns into this whole mythology. And
Mhm.
it fits strangely into the ufological phenomena because not a lot of people talk about it. I don't think a lot of people know about it. But it could also, do more harm than good for making the case for the thing, I think. Because
Maybe, but
of
I guess
the
it depends
absurdity
what
of it.
case.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
what case wants to be made.
I'm thinking more of
Like,
like the
yeah.
UAP crowd on, who are
Oh
like,
yeah, no,
yeah,
they don't want to
yeah.
look at that
The nuts
because
and boltsers.
yeah, if I guess the only person that it would make much sense to use as evidence for would be people who think of this as some weird technologically disguised supernatural thing that changes with us. That's the only sort of because otherwise it's just a totally bizarre anomaly in something where you're trying to make a scientific case for it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Um, yes, but so I don't know. That's why I wanted to really get into Jadoo. And there's a weird, crazy coincidence too that really surprised me. And I have to say, I mean, we're talking about sensationalism and yellow journalism, and actually, for what I've read of this book so far, I'm about 3/4 through. It's a really short book, but it kind of had a lot going on in the past week. But he plays it pretty straight. It seems like he did do a lot of traveling at this time, and there's a couple parts that's are a little bit harder to swallow than others. But he spends some
Yeah,
time with the Yazidis, which is rings the Lavenda bell immediately,
right.
because Lavenda talks about the Yazidis and the connection, and Grant writes a little bit about them too. But they are kind of this alluring occult object.
Right. They're interesting. It's
Yeah,
like, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's an interesting religion, yeah.
For sure.
That's
They
cool.
worship. They're basically a dualistic religion that seems to come out of be influenced by Zoroastrianism and obviously elements of Christianity, but they believe in God and the virtue of God, but they worship the devil because they believe that the devil will actually like spite you. So
Huh.
they kind of have like are garnering the favor of Satan. And I'm sure that's oversimplifying it, but I think that's kind of what creates the Western occult intrigue about the Yazicis. They seem to have a really, really. I mean, they have very, very interesting temples and stuff like that. You see in the photos, right, of the Yazidi. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, they're really crazy looking. But
They have like the peacock thing, right?
yeah, the peacock is the is like a symbol of their mythology. I have a book on the Yazidis. I need to dig into that. But yeah, so Keel he's in Egypt originally, and he's kind of just talking about like the hanging out with like smugglers, and he's trying to study like snake charmers and stuff like that, and he learns all these magic tricks and kind of street tricks, and it's kind of hard to believe when you like see Keel in an interview like later in life that this is the guy who's like out there doing this.
Yeah.
But
Like
it
adventuring.
must have been a little bit cooler in the 50s or something. Because he talks
I
a
don't
lot
know.
about doing magic, like street magic with people in this book.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Huh.
which yeah, it's not a side of him I knew about, but maybe that's well known.
Jadoo.
Yeah. So yeah, he's in Egypt. He kind of like gets really low on cash, and then he goes to Baghdad, and then this rich sheikh there is like, you should come study the Yazidis, and then he goes there, and it's like it's pretty interesting. And then they tell him about the folklore of Ali Baba and being this like actual revolutionary character of the Kurds from the Kurdish
Hmm.
Revolution. And then Keel talks about like going back to Baghdad and meeting Ali Baba, and then he's playing Russian roulette with him. So that's the part where I'm like, there's got to be a line here somewhere. But
Yeah.
there's little things like that in there, but it's truly not that sensational. Actually, it's kind of an interesting travelogue.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to read that someday. Um, it's kind of like how John Mack, his first book was about Lawrence of Arabia. Like, so there's this weird. I mean, I wouldn't call that exoticism, but it does seem like there might be a like Orientalist to UFO writer pipeline to some extent.
Certainly, I mean, Adamski obviously had that as well. I'm sure it was culturally in vogue, like
That's true, right?
yeah,
And the Eastern mysticism stuff was so enticing and new to people. So it may for especially for like thrill seekers or like spiritual questers, I feel like it's probably a pretty well-traveled path between those two things.
yeah, yeah, and obviously, like there's Theosophy has a lot of,
Of course. Yeah.
but I don't know if it's more of a transmutation there, but it's certainly
Yeah.
embedded.
Theosophy was the first remix. We think of
Have you
that.
said that one before? I feel like
I don't know. I
that.
hope not, because I felt like I just made it up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The old brain is rying up. Um, Another thing. So last time I talked about this book, M.K. Jessup, the Allende letters and Gravity. It was called a Borderland Science book, and I talked about how it was annotated and how I was kind of going back and forth with that guy Nick, a listener of the podcast, and pretty serious archiver in his own right. And I think he kind of figured out that it might have belonged to this like crazy collector slash probable white supremacist named, I guess I won't say his name. I don't know if he's still alive, but we kind of
Good
figured out
call.
uh, this fascinating connection. And that kind of got me back on the trail of like how I feel like I saw some person on Twitter talk about how like there's always a connection between UFOs and Nazis. And I was like, that's kind of annoying to say. And I think that that's a dumb take. But at the same time, it's true. I just wouldn't say it like that. It's not always there. But there is this really interesting relationship between like neo-Nazis, like post World War II, not like real Nazis, but like post World War II, uh, Germanic fetishizing like subcultures and the UFO thing. And that crossover is so interesting. And I think that there's a lot there. And there's a lot there that has been studied by people like Jocelyn Godwin in that book we talked about a few years ago, which I just can't remember anymore, about the hollow earth and polar kind of mysticism. But the whole Hyperborean thing, like all this stuff, all this sort of like these Nazi mythological kind of like keywords are so intertwined with the UFO thing. And it kind of put me in this weird mindset, like, is there some strange Nazi aspect to like the death of MK Jessup, or like is there some sort of like in the Allende, Carl Allen, in that Philadelphia experiment subplot, is there some sort of strange like and the way it appears for people like Jim Brandon, the pseudonym, like all of the sort of Nazi stuff that flows through Fortiana is so strange and interesting. And like, yeah, you just wonder, like, of all the stuff that has been uncovered, all the pseudonyms and all the weird connections, how much hasn't been uncovered? Like all of these minor players who are annotating random copies of Borderland Publications zines, basically pretending to be Carl Allen or the ghost of MK Jessup, like all this crazy shit that is like, yeah, it's just it kind of like opens this weird vista about who is sort of who the movers and shakers are in this tiny little subculture, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I could already see a few jumping points when looking at Jessup like that, but I feel like I've relegated myself to just believe that it's kind of a more of a straight story than we
You think
all.
he just killed himself?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what do I know?
He definitely did.
What do I know? But I mean, I don't know why. I feel like something we looked at recently kind of made me feel that was maybe it was the Barker stuff and the kind of the way that Barker like took the story and changed it into this modern mythology. But then Jessup was interestingly like a hard critic of like Bible interpretive UFO stuff, and probably the rising ancient aliens type Von Daniken
Cartel
stuff as well. Yeah, the cartel.
the ancient aliens cartel. It does feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's also like when you say there's been a Nazi intrigue or neo-Nazi intrigue in ufological topics, I think that it's obviously it's more that they recognize that this is a fertile ground to spread clandestine ideas,
Like to recruit. You think it's like a recruitment zone, like because these people are already like open to fringe topics? I don't know.
I mean, it's like the way that both the Nazis and the communists were using theosophy during World War II and World War One. Well, I guess it's earlier. It's before World War One, really. But they were like, there's a huge thing about looking at theosophical lodges and the way that the Bolsheviks were supposedly basically using them as a recruitment tool, and that's the whole thing with Nicholas Roerich being this.
Hmm.
People argue whether or not he was this Bolshevik infiltrator within the Theosophical lodges. But I
He
think
didn't
that
seem very Bolshevik to me,
oh
but
no, there was stuff. There was a lot of stuff with his son and the way that his son was connected, and
uh,
yeah, I mean what.
interesting.
Yeah, there's certainly out there. That's in that book, Tournament of Shadows, which is this
Oh yeah,
crazy book on a lot of the war in Asia around that time, and the way that these figures kind of found their way, infiltrating these different political upheavals and stuff. That's a crazy book. It's huge, but there's a fascinating chapter just on Rourke in there, and I think they call him the Guru.
hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the same could obviously be said for ufology. We know that what the silver shirts and stuff, and
Oh yeah,
William
all
Dudley
that stuff.
Pelly and all the early
Uh,
stuff has like it's using it as a tool, right? And obviously there's
George Hunt Williamson, yeah. Oh, I mean,
yeah, and then
especially the contactee stuff.
yeah, and then
I
there's
feel like it tapers off during like the abduction era, but it's still there. Um, and then it kind of reappears. I mean, no, it's always there, but I feel like it being like a main thread is more common in like the contactee stuff, those connections.
yeah, I mean there's also obviously that we've talked about Maria Orsic and the way that that myth is kind of served as some um, neo-Nazi. Uh, I don't know. It kind of like adds this mystical validity to the thing, right?
Right.
Which is what it served to do.
Like all
Um,
fan fiction.
yeah, it's fantasy, so I mean that's like kind of the allure of it, and I mean that was
Yeah.
such a powerful myth making that it's been told as true history so many times.
I know it's people can't tell. And even trying to find out if it's real or not is like a weird challenge because it's so fringe. It's like nobody wants to actually do a real history of it. And so to find a real, debunk of that story is harder than you would think they would want it to be because it's a very infectious and very pro-Nazi like story. So it's kind of interesting that it's just taken as fact so
Yeah,
often.
yeah, and I think that obviously there's got to still be elements of it in the ufological nexus, but that could get into the dangerous, wildly accusational terrain that we, is
Yeah.
yeah is not a good place to start. But I do think I would say that it seems more clearly abundant now in the new age communities and stuff, and
Oh yeah.
the way
Maybe
that
that's a good point for record scratch over to Patreon.
that is that's nice, man. That's a good sell right there.
Um, yeah. So
It's
join
just
us on
a 30
Patreon.
minute diss track after that.
No, I have some serious tea to spill.
Wow. Well, thanks for listening to the free portion of this episode of Consensus on Reality. We hope you enjoyed it. We're going to have some more interviews and some more deep dives into research topics very soon. This serving is one of those in between little look. We got some little looks in though at some stuff, and I'm
Yeah.
not really sure I could really extrapolate enough to do an entire episode on Jadoo, but it's like it's
Right.
an important, interesting read,
Yeah, yeah.
especially in the context of John Keel and how much of a juggernaut he is to
Yeah.
this area of research. So I don't know. Take a look at it if you've never read it. Thumb through it. It's a part of the story for sure. Patreon.com/consensus unreality for just $5 a month. Check it out. And
We have a Discord.
Yeah, we'll jump over to Patreon after this break. And we're back from that break. How did you enjoy the break?
It was great. A lot has changed. I think I said that last. Yeah, no, the way I mean, this is kind of what Naomi Klein was talking about in that Doppelganger book, the so-called like New Age Nazis, like people who kind of drifted from going to yoga into, I guess, ostensibly like the pro-Trump zone, and then from the pro-Trump zone into, I mean, maybe this wasn't the path exactly, but eventually into
they
these,
red
like,
pilled. Come on.
Gaia TV,
On patreon.com/consensus on reality, you will find bonus episodes, written content, and much more. This recording contains an exclusive follow-up and bonus episode only on Patreon. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.